Good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you for that musical interlude. Um, to one of our panelists, I'll let you decide who you think is singing on that song. And thank you, all of you, for joining us today for the third of four talks that we're having in the series, Reimagining Consumer Engagement, Leading with Empathy, Equity, and Integrity. My name is Sharon Topper. I'm a professor of marketing and business here at Emerson in the Department of Marketing Communication. I'd like to review some housekeeping before we start. The panel will be about 45 minutes, and then we will have Q&A. So at any time during the panel, if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A chat in your nav bar. And if your question is selected, I will call your name and we will open your audio for you to ask the question to the panel. And so now I am very, very pleased to introduce Dr. Raul Rice, the Dean of the School of Communications, who will tell us more about the session and the panelists. Dean Rice.
Thank you, Sharon. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to extend another welcome to everyone joining us for this third installment of the Rethinking Consumer Engagement speaker series. Per this year's title, we are exploring how empathy, equity, and integrity relate to how organizations consider their relationship with consumers. While I have the honor of serving as Dean of Emerson's School of Communication, I've spent much of my career as a journalist. So in one way or another, it has been my life's work to uncover or highlight stories about who we are and what we value. Essentially, the story of us is a multifaceted one. Today, we look at that story in terms of who we are and how we are as consumers. Our expert panelists will be discussing the topic, Resetting Buttons, how today's consumers are showing us what really matters. The panel will be led by Dr. Brent Smith, professor and chairperson of our Department of Marketing Communication here at the school. Dr. Smith is an accomplished teacher, scholar, consultant, and practitioner with multifaceted expertise in strategy, analytics, ethics, and global business. Dr. Smith knows quite a lot about leading with empathy, equity, and integrity. So I can't think of anyone better suited to lead this discussion today than him. Brent?
Thank you, Dean Rice. Once again, my name is Brent Smith, Professor of Marketing and Chairperson of the Department of Marketing Communication. Thank you all for joining us for this third installment of our speaker series. Thank you, Sharon, also for bringing all of this together. We really appreciate you. So I have the honor of welcoming three distinguished panelists to join us for a conversation about rethinking consumer engagement. We have Greg Huang, business editor at the Boston Globe, Cinthia Satornino, assistant professor of marketing at the University of Connecticut, and Brian Gottesman, head of video and monetization products at Flipboard. So as we begin with our opening question, I will ask the panelists to offer an introduction of themselves as it provides their vantages on what it means to understand consumer and to engage the consumer. So let me begin by saying that we know that leaders of virtually all sectors have recognized the need to keep thinking about consumer engagement. That said, in recent history, we most certainly have observed, experienced, or otherwise been affected by a variety of prompts to rethink how we understand markets and marketing activities, especially in terms of consumer engagement. Those prompts have also included calls for more empathy, equity, and integrity. So that brings me to the first question for our panelists. On this panel, we certainly represent and even serve rather diverse communities. Let's take a moment to describe how the facets of who we are might inform what we bring to consumer engagement in 2021. Brian, could you get us started?
Sure, thank you, and really excited to be here and be participating in this panel and discussing these topics. So I'll confess that that track that you heard at the beginning of this panel was my old band Chucklehead, and that was me singing. So therefore, I'm also revealing that I have a past in the arts as both a musician and as an actor. That was before I got into tech, product management, and what you might consider a more traditional or a career that has more defined paths. But I think my past as a creative, outside of the standard norms, outside of the 9 to 5 and the day-to-day, and as an independent business person, really for myself and for my bandmates, is always kept. I always keep in my mind a certain empathy for people who are in that line of work, or in any line of work that isn't working for a company, is working for themselves. Really, entrepreneurs in a way, whether or not they're trying to start a company in the garage that's tech-oriented, or they're trying to form a band. They are outside of certain norms, but they need the same products and services as everyone else. And in fact, it's become more and more common for people to be having a side gig and that becoming their gig. And brands and marketing obviously need to address them as much as any other demographic.
Well, thank you, Brian. Cinthia.
Thank you, Brent. That's very cool, Brian, that was your old band. I always joke that I'm an artist masquerading as a PhD, although visual artist, I can't hold a tune. Thank you so much for having me here. I would say that as a marketing practitioner and as a scholar, I have sort of a unique vantage point in that I'm not only engaged in the marketplace as a consumer, like most of us are, but I also have to stay up to date with what's happening in the market, how consumers are reacting to what's going on around us in real time, because my job as an academic is to train the up and coming marketing practitioners on how to grapple with these, what used to be once in a lifetime events that are now becoming all too common. But beyond just witnessing and experiencing it and reporting on it, I also, as a scholar, am driven to understand the scientifically why these things are happening, what's causing them, how we can react to them in a more future focused way. And so I think that gives me kind of a unique viewpoint in a sort of more holistic 360 view of not only how we're reacting now, but what we can do in the future to either improve the situation, address the situation, or anticipate the situation and understand why these things are happening.
Thank you so much, Cinthia. And Greg, if you would share your thoughts on this one.
Sure. Thank you, Brent and team, for having me. It's great to be here today. I will share that I first saw Brian's band Chucklehead back in my early MIT days, and I'll spare you all the year, but saw them several times. So my training is actually in electrical engineering, and so I did some research on robotics and in software and scientific computing before switching into journalism in the early 2000s, I would say. So I've been at the Boston Globe for just over a year now. Before that was a reporter and editor covering at various publications, covering science, technology, things that I know. And then past 10 years or so, more mainstream business and innovation. So I would say I bring kind of a scientific bent to looking for stories, but I'm also very interested in people and communities. And I mean, artistically, I've also been playing in rock bands for many years. So this is an interesting mix of people. We all have this kind of arts and science and tech. So just great to be here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And if I'll just play on our artistic backgrounds in music or visual arts. So, the folks who mentored me in music and music performance on stage, said you want the people to say more, not no more. So might we use that as a prompt maybe for this next question? From your vantage, what do you think consumers are saying? We want more of this, we want no more of that. Cinthia, would you start us off, and then we'll follow with Greg and then to Brian.
Sorry, I realized I was muted. Happy to start this off. I recently published a paper comparing consumers to ants. In that ants don't have some central organizing body that tells them you should go be a worker, you should go be a worker, you should feed, which work should you do? Should you go get food? Should you take care of the baby ants? Whatever. Instead, what they use is signals in their environment. The various ants leave signals in their environment that other ants pick up. They're just behaving, they're doing their thing and leaving these signals in the environment that other ants pick up. And when they pick up a certain amount of signals, they influences their own behavior without anyone telling them what to do. And that's kind of in some ways the way consumers behave, especially in the consumption space. As they're exposed to more and more information in the marketplace from other consumers just doing their thing, it influences their own behavior. And I had an interesting discussion with my students, in fact, this week, about we were talking about branding ethics, and we were talking about companies building up such brand equity and power that they were able to sort of do some things that maybe are good business, are they, where you can leverage that brand power and that brand influence to actually reduce quality and lower costs in your products while not changing your profit margins or not changing your pricing strategy. And so they talked around the ethics and examples where they felt like that hadn't been a good thing. And the conclusion that we came to was that this generation is so incredibly informed, and so much more than we were at their age, certainly. And they are really zeroing in on this idea of voting with their dollars and putting in into the marketplace their opinions. They understand the power of that in a way that I don't think any other generation ever did. And so it's become a reckoning on the corporate side that you can't just say what you want people to think that your company is, but you actually have to follow through on that and act on that. So one of the things that I think is really critical in understanding consumer trends is to really pay attention to where the money is flowing, and the not only the current flows, but those voices that are starting to pop up that are creating these consumer movements, much like when mainstream beer in the US marketplace was dominated by these big corporations. The craft beer movement actually started as a consumer social movement in rebellion against the poor quality of beer that was available to the average consumer. So these consumer social movements are really picking up steam, and in fact, in a very powerful way, because of all the technology enabling that is available to this generation. So I would say watch where the money goes, because the up and coming generation is paying attention to how they're voting with their dollars.
Wow. Thank you, Cinthia. That certainly gives us a new way to rethink follow the money, right? A different kind of audit.
That's right.
Thank you so much. Greg.
Yeah, sure. And one thing we definitely do, in journalism is follow the money and see where people are spending and how companies are selling. I mean, I can speak to our readers a little bit, and also to the companies that we watch and what and how they're selling. But I would say, I mean, after this year that we've all lived through, one big thing people are interested in is hope. And that touches a lot of different aspects. So, whether it's human stories about turnarounds of survival, or if it's more corporate or businessy stories that are about companies either having a reckoning in terms of equity, distribution, community outreach, things like that. I would say hope is probably the big thing that we're looking at right now.
Great, thank you, Brian. Greg. And Brian.
Yeah, I think more than ever, consumers are looking for authenticity. I think that's been a trend that's been going on for a long time. And I know that advertisers have played with that a little bit by having ads that are sort of winking at the notion that it is an ad and that it is fake. And that's a way of implying that that's real and we're all on the same team. But the dialogue that happens now between a brand and consumer is constant. It didn't used to be that case, but if you're following brand X on Twitter, you're seeing their tweets every day. And you're able to respond. And so there's much more pressure on a brand for that communication to have some sort of value. It's outside of advertising. And in that dialogue, you get exposed much faster if your values-based marketing isn't holding up, isn't consistent, if your message doesn't align with your product. And so there's more pressure to be authentic, but then there's more benefit from being authentic. And if that means that the brand finds a more niche audience, but then there's a tighter alignment and higher loyalty, then that might be the right fit for them. But I think there's an authenticity requirement that users are voting with, and I think it also to some degree might be a reaction to fake news. I mean, it's well understood by everyone that there is a lot of fake news. Now, where you are in the political spectrum may change your perspective about which news is fake and which is real, but the topic about fake news is obviously high in everyone's mind. And news is just a form of content, obviously, but so is messaging from a brand. And so there's more sensitivity than ever to fake information. So I think the onus is on brands to figure out how to be consistent and authentic, and for the words to matter. And I think the consumers respond to that very quickly.
All right, thank you all. So continuing in this vein, during the COVID-19 pandemic, which we are obviously still in, yet probably before it, we've known that people generally look to their friends, influencers, whoever those might be, and the media to understand what matters in the world. As we were growing up, we probably heard some version of "you are what you eat." How might that translate in today's consumer space? So when you think about consumers and what they do through shopping, media consumption, voting, and so forth, how are they showing what really matters to them? If you could offer us an example, that would be good. Let's start with Brian.
Yeah, well, I think that there's two ways that users respond. They respond with dollars, or whatever the denomination is, and or currency, and they respond with time. And it's two different ways of voting, right? And the time in some products, the time is the what the user pays with, right? So Facebook is a product, Flipboard is a product, Twitter is a product, and the user pays with their time, since there isn't a subscription, and then that time is a value to the product because they get to serve ads in that time lot, that the time space that the user is paying attention. It's an attention economy, obviously also surveillance economy and all those other concepts. But users are voting with one or the other. It's either time or money, and time is money, of course, and that's how they vote. And the time is spent either consuming content or creating it themselves and responding. So you'll see, a brand in many ways gets a win, even if the user then goes to the brand's website and then consumes content there. That's just a form of engaging in the advertising. It could be an upper funnel. It could end up being a direct response later. But a lot of times, what I see is brands are, and sometimes just trying to get the user's time, just trying to get their engagement and their attention, and maybe later that will result in a conversion.
Sure. Let me just ask a follow-up for our audience. So in your space in Flipboard, I would imagine you do some curation of news for people. And we've heard for a number of years, especially recently, that people are influenced by what they have read before and by what people in their immediate social circle are also reading, such that it might be limiting their nutrition, as it were, in terms of news and information and consequently insight. What's your take on that in terms of voting with time and also other forms of currency?
Yeah. Well, at Flipboard, we take that very seriously. We have journalists that sit on top of our algorithms. So it isn't just purely based on user behavior. We keep a lid on fake news, toxic commentary. And we also try to find that balance between helping you find your tribe, your community and the content that you're interested in that aligns with your perspective, but also exposing you to some other points of view. So we do have an editorial team that curates magazines and what we call storyboards. And we have something called the Daily Edition, which every day is curated by our editorial team. That's the news of the day. It also has different kind of topic spaces, whether it's cultural, food, tech, DEI topics. And that is always part of the platform. It influences what you get in your For You feed, what our editorial team curates. And so we take very seriously making sure that users are exposed to high quality content that feels personalized to them, but doesn't create that rabbit hole. It's a tricky balance, and it's one that we, every day we have large teams of people that's what they obsess with. Brands do something similar, right? And that they create niche targeting campaigns. You could have one brand have like 7 different campaigns targeting different demographics. And I think it's interesting that sometimes users respond positively and sometimes negatively to that. If they feel over-targeted, or if they feel that they've been bucketized and it doesn't feel that the campaign actually addresses their full self, there can be a negative reaction. Just like I feel a negative reaction if I'm in an aggregation platform and it's too down the middle of my perspective and I want to break out of it and see what other people think. It's one of the areas, because I own the monetization space within Flipboard. It's one of the areas I think about a lot, is how does the curation and targeting of content relate to curation and targeting of advertising?
All right, thanks for those insights. Greg, what say you in this space?
Yeah, I can add a little more from kind of the readership perspective. And I mean, some of this gets to the whole attention economy and like what are people spending time on. But I mean, if there's a big news event around vaccines, or the data around how effective they are in different groups or rollouts, people want to read every story. It's not just like we want to have one piece that wraps it up. We want to have story after story after story that goes into each of these aspects, and people, they're eating it up. So the kind of news cycle that we're in right now, when there are developments that really affect people's lives, they want as much as they can about everything. So and the same would go for, and this speaks a bit to the whole recovery, economic recovery and hope issue. But when it comes to reopening the economy or restaurants and retail stores, people want to know exactly. They want to drill down into what the restrictions are, what's being lifted, and then what does this timeline look like for the next few weeks and next few months as the weather gets better. So I could just start there, but and I mean, I think this affects everything from how companies are marketing what they sell as well, in terms of attention. We don't have to get into this too much, but I mean, just the rise of things like TikTok marketing, and how are they reaching people who are maybe spending a lot more time on their devices now.
Okay, thank you, Greg. And Cinthia, maybe you could offer your take on this also. And so, I know you do quite a bit of research in the consumer space as it relates to social networks and influencers and whatnot. What are you seeing?
I would say I'm going to take a step back a little bit from the current sort of the consuming news and talking more about the priorities that have really bubbled up from our being isolated and experiencing this pandemic together, both economic and social. And I think you're seeing some of the priorities really bubble up in places like entertainment, where the top YouTube music channels are not Eurocentric or US, continental US and Europe, but rather fully global. I think one of the top 25 or 5 out of the top 25 YouTube channel based on music are out of India and out of Colombia and certainly out of Puerto Rico. And so you see this sort of globalization priority where people have been so locked in for so long in their own homes that they're seeking these experiences through their entertainment consumption, for example. And it's really exposing sort of this need for a global perspective. I would also say that Greg, I think, touched on AI and Brian as well, and talked about hope. A couple of things there in terms of consumer trends. You see AI, one of the things that is meant to be the benefit is this personalization, but understanding how overly where's the sweet spot of personalization and when it starts to feel intrusive or claustrophobic. So having personalized at the right degree, the sweet spot is something that companies are going to have to work on, because consumers do want personalized experiences, but there's a trade-off with their privacy and their sense of exposure and adventure, tying back to that need to sort of explore. I think also we're seeing as people are baking bread and getting into the visual arts and making music, you're seeing this need for self-expression that's beyond just the superficial. And so there's certainly a trend there that, and that's why you see so much of the rise of TikTok at this point, is because it's giving people a platform to express themselves. And so that is something that companies really need to take a look at. And it's driven by that network. In terms of those networked relationships, right? And connecting with people. I also think a major priority comes from this sensitization to social issues. And so there is not only, I think it was Euromonitor International just came out with their trends for 2021. And one of the things they talked about is the importance of purpose-driven initiatives. And to Brian's points about authenticity, we have all been bombarded with the preachy sort of, look at me, I'm doing all the right things, without necessarily those being followed through. And so consumers are savvy and saturated with these kinds of messaging, and they want to see authentic messaging around purpose-driven initiatives. And finally, I would say I was having a discussion with someone who runs a consulting firm here in Massachusetts, and they were talking about their amazement. They were Generation X baby boomers, and they were talking about hiring Gen Zs and how amazed they were that they were so adamant in protecting their personal barriers and having boundaries between work and their life. And so all of those sort of trends, I think, are coming from the discussions that you see people are having those conversations on social media and influencing each other to say, it's okay to demand that I'm not going to work 70 hours a week, or I am going to make time to indulge my passion for music, and I'm going to learn how to play guitar. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, which from the Gen X perspective, we were like, work, work, work all the time. So this is a definite major shift. And I think it is being driven by the conversations we're having under the circumstances that we're in, where we're forced to really reflect on our priorities and our values.
All right, thanks. Hey, that's really deep. Thank you. One wonders as we're in this moment and as we move beyond it, whatever that will mean, that we will probably discover that we took time intentionally to discover more about ourselves, share more about ourselves with others, and also to understand those things that really do connect us, right? In ways that maybe we learned we weren't so connected, or we're not so interdependent. Maybe we're rediscovering some of the value creation potential that we have in sharing and whatnot. So kind of continuing in this vein of statements, you mentioned companies sometimes being preachy. So just to shout out our home city of Boston, once upon a time, there was this music group known as Extreme, and they came out with a song that was kind of different than the other music they put out, and it's probably one of their bigger hits, called More Than Words. So on the topic, more than words, what companies out there do you believe seem to be about more than words, making statements on diversity, equity, and inclusion, aka DEI, or making more than statements about we stand with this, we stand with that? What's a good example or two of someone or something happening right now? Or maybe an example that might not be so good. Just don't name the company. Yeah, anyone may start us off. Go ahead, Greg.
I can jump in, sure. I mean, I stepping back just a bit, I do feel like there was a threshold crossed at some point in the past year where more companies were going beyond the boilerplate statements that they always make, and have backed it up with some action, some money, some initiatives. Now it remains to be seen how far those go and how much impact and how much this stays in the national discussion. but I mean, just a couple examples, off the top of my head. So I mean, Bank of America, right? They have an initiative. I think it's $1 billion over 4 years, and they've committed maybe 300 million of that so far to jobs programs, community outreach, and other areas of diversity and inclusion. It's going to take time to see what comes of those, but that's the kind of thing we will track in the media. What's the actual impact of that on real people in their lives? Just on another kind of end of the spectrum, I mean, one big issue in inclusion has been in the medical side. The diversity of clinical trial participants. From the big vaccine efforts that we're seeing in the past year to more rare diseases. So I mean, I would go with the big vaccine makers really trying hard to enroll participants in their trials that reflect the real population, as well as efforts from biotech community, some companies locally, including I think Sarepta Therapeutics is one of them that have really tried to come together to boost the diversity of their clinical trial patients. So just a couple quick things.
Okay, good. So you seem to be pointing to indicators of evidence that companies are aware that consumers are not just consumers, that consumers may be one slice of who they are as a person. So they're saying, okay, company X, what are you doing in relation to the communities that I belong to? How do you speak to my other interests as part of my portfolio of me, perhaps? Right? Brian, could you maybe chime in on this as well? What were you in terms of more than statements? And I know you're doing some DEI work maybe in terms of your team, right?
Yeah, perhaps obviously this will be an opportunity to put in a plug for Flipboard. Yeah, we took it really seriously in-house. And I feel good about the way that expressed itself. It was not just public statements. We changed the way that we work internally because I think it's clear that the way that the company operates and the way that it builds its products, the way that the team works is reflected in the result. It's inevitable. So that who you have on your team, who you have on your board, who is in leadership will impact what you produce. So we've changed a number of things in our company. We've changed hiring practices. We have a weekly meeting that we call the huddle. And now the first 5 to 10 minutes of every meeting is a DEI conversation. It's a different topic. And so we're living those values in the company. And then in our practices, the editorial team has doubled down, tripled down really on the effort of bringing in other voices that maybe weren't getting as much exposure, adding additional curators, including different kinds of bloggers who may not be part of a major publication into certain topics that are curated, making sure that we curate, publishers and curators create magazines around certain topics, and all that influences the general mix of what you get in Flipboard. So I think Flipboard's content has definitely gotten more diverse and more inclusive since I would say last summer, and I'm really proud of it. Just simple examples like a series recently on African American food and having some African American and Black writers contribute to storyboards around food and culture and how they connect. It was a great series as part of our overall Tastemaker series, I think it was called. I think in terms of other companies, one of the things that's been interesting to observe is when companies are stepping into this realm and it hasn't really been part of their culture before, and users, like I was talking about authenticity before, like they're looking at it like, really? And so is that right? Are you sure? How far afield from how historically you've presented yourself is this kind of statement? So a classic example that came out is, Ben and Jerry's response to Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests was very strong. We must dismantle, white supremacy, like a very forceful language, but it was really an extension of the values-based marketing and their activism that they've always had. Like it was powerful, but it was of a piece. It was just taking it to the next level. Whereas, I think initially, like the NFL did a lot, driven by their players, not by owners, to make public statements. And you could see that in the marketing around and during the Super Bowl, and how much of that was DEI focused. And some of it felt true, but some of it still felt a little forced. And I think part of that is that dichotomy between what the players represent in their viewpoint, and then the ownership and Roger Goodell, et cetera, feeling like they're getting dragged into it. So I still think there's a struggle for companies to adapt and make it true to themselves if it hasn't been before. And I think that's just one of the things that takes time. And I think ultimately consumers will have some patience if they feel like there's progress, if they feel like the company's heart is in it, and they made an investment and it continues, and it isn't just a one-off. And companies don't change overnight. You can't change your board entirely overnight. You can't change your team entirely overnight. But as long as there's progress and it's serious and it's consistent and it doesn't seem trendy, then I think it works for the consumer.
All right, thanks, Brian. And as we shift over to Cinthia, I think about what we do in the classroom and what we do in the scholarly research we do, and in marketing, academe, and scholarship. We've been looking at prosumer, producer, and consumer, and I think we're seeing very clear evidence of that now, where the consumer is very much co-producing with companies, with organizations, what the brand is going to mean, and maybe what its trajectory should look like going ahead, maybe in ways that our generation just didn't have that kind of that pull or that gravity. But as you've mentioned, Brian, the conversations with brands happening daily, right? There are daily prompts, so companies really have to be very attentive. There are business imperatives, but there are also broader social imperatives. So kind of on that note, Cinthia, so more than statement, company comes out with a statement. How should they understand, is that, what does the statement need to say? And is the statement really one just for the written word? How else might they make a statement? And you're on mute if you can hear.
To Brian's point, it really is in order to be authentic and effective, it has to be aligned with what the company has been doing and where they're looking to head, how much they're willing to invest. Over-promising and under-delivering is the kiss of death in this space. And I think that, to your point about pro-consumers, involving your consumers, your target consumers in that conversation is so important. But if I can connect this question back to the sort of diversity and inclusion in terms of why it's important, because we've all heard the damage of echo chambers. We've experienced the damage of echo chambers, and our decision about the things that don't agree with us is fake news. The troubling part is that our social networks are in there with us. They're in those echo chambers with us. And so we're not exposed to people who we trust or we interact with personally that are maybe from a different perspective. And so diversity and inclusion is important because it allows voices, diverse voices. And when I say diversity, I'm not just talking about ethnic or racial or gender diversity, but I'm also speaking of life experience, diverse life experiences, so that we have different voices in the room with us when we're at work, when we're at school. That's how the echo chambers become porous. And so these diversity, inclusion, and equity initiatives, what they do is allow those voices to come into the echo chamber, but it has to be coupled with, it can't just be diversity. It can't just be superficial. It has to be coupled with inclusion and sponsorship, advocacy, championing those diverse voices to be heard, because it's great to check the box that you have X amount of underrepresented minorities or women on your boards. That's great. It's a first step. But if those voices are subjugated, then or aren't elevated so that they can be heard, then there is no real authentic effect. And so it's about involving, like inviting those consumers in who are willing to share with you their experiences, and then actually taking them into account, truly making them pro-consumers, truly making them a part of the conversation. And those people in your boards and in your management and in the field that are diverse voices, really actually listening to them. And in terms of organizations that are doing this well, I have to, tap into three different things. One, must give a plug to UConn. They have really made me proud to be there during this very challenging time. They have really raised their voices in terms of not perfect, many missteps, but trying and authentically trying. And so I'm proud to be a part of that organization. I will also say KPMG, who has been a big advocate in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion since the 90s, before it was popular, before it was cool, they were doing this stuff, right? And they have taken so much on in terms of doing that. I think most universities in general, and then KPMG. So I would say certainly Emerson is, just looking at this panel and the dean, Emerson has certainly been at the forefront of that. And I think universities in many ways have been bastions, and KPMG with their PhD project has been a partner with universities in that. But I have to give a plug to a show that I thought handled this very well. I don't know if you all are familiar with Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist. Have any of you watched that show? This season, they have recently tackled this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And I thought it was done in a really intelligent way, not preachy, not look at me, I'm doing this thing that we're so cool and we're supposed to do this and I'm checking the box, but in a way that was really intelligent. And I have to believe that there are voices behind that production that really understood the truth of what they were talking about and were able to communicate that in an authentic way. So I know I answered your question in 4 different ways, Brent, but hopefully I tapped into what you were looking to get.
That was excellent. Thank you for taking us to school. Because as long as I can use some of these insights in my own classes, then we're all good, which I will. Yeah. So, and really, thank you so much. And I do also, as Cynthia noted, want to give a little shout out to the PhD project, right, which is a major initiative from the KPMG Foundation. So when we think about consumer, right, we often look to the private sector and the marketplace it serves, but we also know as educators that students are also consumers of ideas, of thoughts, and they're also prosumers, producers and consumers of those. And the PhD project has really played an instrumental role, as Cynthia noted before, it was a popular thing to do because they understood that diversifying the front of the classroom, right, and even diversifying those who would teach only via Zoom, that it would affect a lot of change for the future in sustained ways. So another way to appreciate value with sustainability. So thank you, KPMG Foundation and PhD Project, and Bernie Milani, we see you. All right, so just one final question for our guests. Let's go in our original order, I guess. Brian, Cynthia, Greg. So from your vantage, as you see things, what is one thing that consumers could do maybe a little bit better to serve their own interests?
So, there's always more you could do to be informed. And it's tricky because there's a glut of information right now. And so people sort of assume that they're well informed because there's no shortage of information coming at them. But it requires more effort, I guess, to be discerning. So this applies to both brand messaging and to news content, to memes, to what the YouTube comments say. So I think finding additional ways to figure out how to be informed, where to get your sources from, and of those sources, which of their messaging is really just marketing and which of it is true, and listening, reading between the lines sometimes. And a lot of this does come back to authenticity, but consumers can always do more to be informed. And then I think one of the most challenging things can be, just like brands need to live their truth, the consumers do too. Brands will do values-based marketing, but that only works if people shop based on their values. I think we started to see that trend where every brand had a green product, every household cleaner so suddenly had a green version because being environmentally friendly was like the hot thing, whether or not they were all green or true. But then that can also be true of organics, and sometimes that comes down to an economic decision. Is the organic one more expensive? And then you have some tough choices depending on your level of income. But I would say you could always do more to be informed and respond to the values that a brand could put out there by shopping accordingly.
All right, thanks so much, Brian. Cinthia.
Okay, well, that's a big question, right? Because it puts so much onus on the consumer. And I think that I would say, I would echo what Brian said in terms of using your dollars aligned with your values. But I would also say, be informed about the kinds of regulations that are going on that are there to, people are trying to do the right thing. Things like creating a public credit reporting agency under the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's something that's coming up right now. And the credit system has been, the credit bureau reporting system has been shown to be extremely biased and have a lot of repercussions across the marketplace for consumers. And so not only voting with every dollar, but literally voting right, in the political process for your best interests, and I think is so critical. Certainly sharing that information with people, because tapping into those social networks, the power of those social networks, and ensuring that your social networks are porous to allow diverse voices in. Those are the recommendations I would make.
Thank you so much, Cinthia. All right, and really nice recognition also of the intersectionality between voting, right, our political voice in democracy, and our currency voice in capitalism, right? Thank you. And Greg.
I feel, coming out of this, or we're still in it, but after this year, we've probably never been more siloed and isolated in our own kind of communities and who we talk to, and it's because of the fatigue. It's hard to reach across sometimes and make new connections. And I guess I would just say I would encourage people to, whether it's as consumers or as people, just to reach out and talk to more people, talk to as many different kinds of people as you can, because we're well aware that the country is divided, and politically and economically and socially. Whatever we can all do to on a one individual basis to break down those divides, to bridge them, I think will be good for everyone. And just one other thought came to mind on kind of the future of local businesses as well. I mean, we're looking at what is the downtown, what's downtown's going to look like after this? How with office workers coming back, or at some reduced rates, and just the impact that has, the ripple effect that has on merchants, businesses, small shops, restaurants. So I guess just think about where you want to spend your dollars, as we've been talking about a little bit here.
Great, thank you, Greg. And that's a very important point, and each of you three has in some way kind of tapped this idea of spending per your values. And we know that community, however you define that, matters to each individual, matters to each of us, all of us, right? No one of us is more important than all of us. And so we know that small business owners on Main Street somewhere downtown, jump in joy, when they have a customer that comes back, when they get new customers, and when we tell our friends about them. So let's keep them in mind as we kind of get through this and come out of it. Okay, so thank you so much, Brian, Cinthia, Greg. This has been a wonderful panel. I have learned so much. I just get excited when I get to talk to folks like you every day. So that makes my job even not really a job. It's like an opportunity with a prize every day. So thank you so much. I got 3 prizes and the day's not even over yet. So we will now transition into a broader question and answer session. We will hear back with Sharon Topper, who will moderate the Q&A for us in the time that we have remaining. Thanks so much again.
Thank you, Brent. Cinthia, by the way, I love Zoe's playlist. I think that has brought me so much joy during the pandemic. Like, that's on the top of my list when people ask, like, how do you get through? Just so hopeful and happy. Yeah. So there you go. So let's start with Brenna McCormick.
Hi, thank you so much for this really insightful conversation today. My question is about actually generational segments, and something that Cinthia mentioned about Gen Xers kind of triggered this question. I was just really aware during the Super Bowl commercials of how many like 90s references there were. And I was curious if you had any insights into like if there is, because Gen X has always been the like left out generational segment, and now I feel like, oh, they've discovered us. But I'm just curious if you feel like in the past year, any of the significance or importance, understanding, or even empathy towards each of the different generational segments has changed, through the light of COVID and through the light of just kind of all of us living through a pandemic with, a lot of very somber moments, but then also moments where there are spaces where we're connecting.
I will say this. Speaking of hope, the theme from Greg, speaking of hope, I saw recently on a news, not a news, but like a fun article where Gen Z was making fun of the millennials. I'm sure you've heard this. It's a TikTok trend now where Gen Z is making fun of millennials and everything that they thought was cool. And then of course the millennials make fun of the boomers. And so some Gen Xers were piping in like, what about us? We're this tiny generation, right? And so as I watch my 17-year-old son wear clothing that he thinks is super cool, but is actually from the 90s and my Gen Xers, I think we're not as forgotten as we think we are. Our fashion is coming back, God help us. But on a more somber note, in terms of your question on empathy, I think what we've realized as consumers and what is really touching off that gave me a sense of normalcy, right? Here, watching these little snippets of making fun of each other and teasing each other like big brother, big sister, kind of little sister kind of stuff. But on the other hand, I think it also made us realize that we're all in this together. And so those generational things yes, we're divided. Yes, there are politics that separate generations and economic situations. But I think that what we have seen come through the noise in this pandemic cannot be unseen. Where there is no going back to whatever normal was before this, because we can't stop being aware that we are all affected by this, and that generationally there's some changes and some things that have some trends that have been stopped short because we've seen the impacts that it's had on the generations coming after us. And I think when you couple that with the megaphone that the younger generations have that our generation didn't have when we were in their age, we really can't just ignore those challenges that we've faced under the pandemic. And so to answer your point more succinctly, which is not my strength, yes, I think that empathy has increased because we have seen what we've all gone through. We've experienced this together. And I think those generational differences will exist, but the empathy between generations will certainly, I think about the fact that my kids, their expectancy in terms of reaching wealth is lower than mine, and my parents says something and it alarms us, right? So yeah, I think empathy is definitely heightened.
Wonderful. So if the other two panelists don't have something to add, I'll go to the next question. Okay. We have an anonymous attendee who is asking, I would love to hear your opinions on how the topics you've been discussing intersect with consumer data usage. It is often spoken about as both a positive and a negative. Curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, maybe I'll talk to that one because I certainly am close to the data, and I've been close to the data on both sides. Before I was at Flipboard, I worked at Amazon serving advertisers, and Amazon is certainly one of the kings of collecting data. It's that double-edged sword, right? I mean, if you take Amazon, for example, they can have a pretty good guess of what it is that you're in the market for based on previous shopping behavior. And they will serve you ads based on what you've maybe put in your cart but didn't actually buy. And a lot of times that can be really helpful, but to the point that Cinthia was making earlier, like then there's that uncanny valley moment when it's like, wait a minute, how much do you actually know about me? Especially if they then drift off to another site and it's the same ad. The same thing is true. So for every company that uses that kind of data, you have to figure out where that line is. And the line got so far over in the direction towards the companies that, and this was brought up earlier about regulations that started to push back. You have GDPR, you have CCPA. Apple is taking the initiative to get rid of mobile ad IDs, or also known as IDFA. Google is going into a cookieless world. Like, companies are, in terms about like speaking, doing value-based marketing, both Apple and Google are positioning themselves as privacy friendly, as trying to putting their ears to the rails of what consumers want, and they're making that part of their branding, and they're living that by taking out the opportunity to have these trackers follow people around. And then governments have done the same thing. Governments, they're not necessarily branding in the same way that brands are, but governments like the EU have responded with privacy regulations. And so there has been pushback, but sometimes, it's not always the case that users don't want that data to help them be more personalized. I mean, you're talking about the term prosumer came up earlier. One of the original definitions of that was the user customization per the user really defining exactly the product that they get, right? And if you go into your For You feed of Flipboard, or you go into Facebook or into Netflix, you are getting a customized version of the product for you, right? And that is only because of the data that is collected by that product that over time builds a profile of you and figures out what you want. You're on Netflix and you see a whole bunch of movies that you're not at all interested in. It's not, the product isn't working for you, and that's only because of the data. And so it's just there. This is just the trickiest balance, and all of these platforms, including Flipboard, work this problem every single day. But the hand is forced when users vote by leaving a platform if it goes too far, or governments step in and say, we're not going to allow this anymore, or a major platform that provides the infrastructure like Google or Apple step in and say, we're going to cut off one of these tracking IDs. And then brands will then find another way of running ad campaigns. If they can't do audience-based targeting, then it becomes contextual, which is still personalized, but is more anonymized. I could talk for a really long time about data, but I'll leave it there and let some of the other panelists chime in.
Yeah, if I could chime in briefly, something we didn't touch upon, but Cinthia mentioned generations, as did Brenda McCormick. Something I think about as a parent of young children is, as a web developer in the 90s, I was doing cookies and a lot of other things to learn about my users. When I think though, I began with a paper and pencil, went to a typewriter, got to the thing called the internet, so on and so forth. With young children, they're starting there. So that's a native experience for them, where there might be some cost of having an interaction be so refined that it prevents some exploration on their part. So as we kind of rethink that consumer engagement, what might be some of the additional pros and cons of being so refined with the offering for the consumer, whereas the customer, the parent, might have to say, well, not enough, not too much of that just yet.
If I may also jump in, I had a conversation. It's funny that you asked this, because I had a little mini focus group with my class just the other day. We were talking about privacy and the benefits and the pros and cons of serving. And I don't know about you all on the panel, but I've noticed it's a trend. I asked this question. We have this discussion many times over the course of the last 10 years that I've been in classrooms. And there was a shift suddenly. And I believe it's when Gen Z started entering my classroom, speaking to Brent's point about this being a native experience. They're like, we know they're tracking us. We don't care they're tracking us, but here's the things we want. And so we set out in one class period to solve the problems of privacy and data usage by companies. And the things they came up with were things like, I know you're using my data, tell me, right, how you're using it. Be transparent, and not in these long user agreements that nobody ever reads and just clicks I agree, but be transparent in a way that is digestible to me. When you're using my data, let me know. When you're using my data, do it for my benefit. if you're using my data, that's an asset I own. You should compensate me in some way, right? And so we talked about them. If they're not the customer, they're the product, and that's how you're getting paid, is you're getting usage for a certain app. And so we kind of talked about all of this, and really what it came down to for that generation, which is different than others, is take my data, but tell me how you're using it, every way that you're using it in a way that I can understand. So I think that's something that's companies need to speak to.
Wonderful. And also, when we're finished doing business, give me my data back, right? Okay, next question is from Chris Taroni. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
No, you did perfectly. And I just want to echo what Brenna was saying too. This has been incredibly insightful, and really appreciate the diverse cast we have on here. So hopefully this question kind of opens up to a kind of a myriad of ways of looking at it. In that, which pandemic consumer behavior fads do you see becoming normal or become normalized? And I guess maybe not in 21, maybe in 22, as some things become more resonant than they are already right now. Thank you.
I can start off on that. I mean, it's a great question, and all thinking about what are the permanent shifts here, and what might go back to the way things were before, which is probably not a lot, actually. I mean, what we're all on right now is one example. I think of the whole Zoom telepresence phenomenon for school, for business meetings, for brainstorming, collaboration. This has been normalized, and I think it stays. And to get back a little bit to the previous question, I mean, I think we have to push back a little bit against the sort of transactional nature of these interfaces, of, and try to bring more spontaneity, more serendipity into our interactions, just because we are so siloed right now. So that will be interesting to watch how that happens, what the dynamics of office return is going to look like. Is there going to be some kind of a hybrid model? How do you do these conference calls where some of the people are in the office and others are at home? That's not a new thing, but it's going to be much more prevalent. I can stop there. Those are the first things that come to mind.
I think one of the things that I'm keeping an eye on is there was obviously a trend to do things yourself, the DIYers, because they had to. They couldn't go to the barber anymore, and so they had to learn to cut hair. I cut my kids' hair now. I'm no good at it, but too bad. But it'll be interesting to see, like, at the quote end of this, if there's a period where it feels like it's near the end, do people feel like, I really enjoyed that, doing it myself, and I want to keep doing it? Or it's like, I cannot wait to go back to a professional. I don't like the hassle anymore. I think that also applies to cooking. People cooked a lot more, especially at the beginning, when even like takeout kind of shut down, and then takeout was the break from that. And it'll be interesting to see the degree to which, people baking bread continues, or they're like, I can't wait to not have to deal with that anymore. I love doing it, but I'm going to spend the next year not baking anymore and going to the baker, or I'm going to go out to dinner more because I can. I think there'll be some kind of pull and push-pull there. I think people will be desperate to connect and have community, which, Brent talked about community earlier. We obviously have the Zoom community, which has facilitated a lot, but getting out into a restaurant full of your neighbors, I think is going to be a driving force for people to drop some of the things that they were doing at home because they had to. But I think there will be a residual effect of people coming back and said, yeah, you know what? Spending an afternoon doing this kind of home project, or making this kind of meal, or baking bread that really brought something new into our home, created new kinds of memories and traditions in a way that I think we'd like to keep.
I would second what you all said, and also tap into my top 5 things I think are going to stick around based on reading and research. I would say that definitely the importance of boundaries, personal boundaries, is going to stick around. We were forced working from home to force ourselves to leave work, even though that meant the next room, right? And I think that that practicing that muscle of saying, this is where work belongs, this is where home belongs, is going to stick around. I would definitely say that hygiene and safety, food safety and hygiene and the things that make us feel comfortable in terms of sanitation are going to stick around. I think that's part of our sort of neuroses from this experience for certainly. I think flexibility, this idea that things have to happen on this certain timetable, has been just shattered. And I don't know that there's going back from that. And then finally, and for me, super positively, I think that connection to nature, that appreciation for nature and the outdoors, number one, and number two, the arts, is really going to come back full-fledged. I don't know about you all, but I'm usually a singer-songwriter, alternative music kind of girl. And I found myself really appreciating and going back to classical music, or I found myself doing the tours of the museums, which is not unusual for me, but having those available for me. So that tapping into that soulful, deep meaning thing that we've kind of set aside as entertainment, but is really soul feeding, is going to stick around, which I think is great news for art and entertainment, and for our health crisis here to be more connected with nature and the outdoors.
Amen.
Can I just one thing I was thinking about, Greg mentioned Zoom here to stay. When I think about entertainment, just one thing that comes to mind is ableism, right? And how Zoom has enabled more people to participate and be present. And I think we will, as we move forward, begin to think more intentionally about, well, who was present during the Zoom that isn't present now? And we need to fix that, right? So when people go to hockey games, they go to musical concerts, we need to make sure everyone can have that experience. Whether they can drive there, take the train, the subway, or whatever. We need to make sure everyone can be present in that situation with us.
Wonderful. I have one final question for the panelists and Brent, and our moderator. This whole series came out of a real reckoning in so many different areas of our society. And our students are the leaders and communicators of the next generation, right? If you had one piece of advice to give them from your own experience on being a good leader and being a good communicator, what would that be?
Well, I guess I'll jump in and say empathy. It's obviously a major topic of this series, if not the topic, and I think that's what makes an effective leader. And I think that's what makes an effective company. I think you have to lead with empathy. Empathy starts with compassion and curiosity, and you have to remember that it isn't always about you. There's a phrase, your title makes you the manager, but your people make you the leader. And that's the way it is. Like you will know pretty quickly if you're trying to get something off the ground, if you're leading a band, if you're an entrepreneur, if you've started a website, if you're created a restaurant, the people that you're building your team around will let you know right away if you're an effective leader. It doesn't matter what your title is. And it starts with being an advocate for them, being an advocate for the consumer of your product, and that starts with empathy. That starts with putting yourself in their shoes and understanding them. If it's your staff, it's what is their work-life balance. If it's their user, what's the user problem? What's the problem statement you're solving? And solve it for them as them, not as yourself. And it's, I think that empathy obviously needs to apply to all aspects of our lives. And we're not going to get through this phase that we're in, whether or not we're talking about health or politics, unless we can live that kind of empathy.
I would certainly agree wholeheartedly with Brian, and I would add to that unapologetic authenticity. People need to feel who you are as a leader. When you're leading a group of people through a trying time like this, they need to see you, the person, not just you, your title, or to your point, right? That the people make you a leader, Brian. You need to be unapologetically authentic in everything that you do, because if you believe in something and if you truly deeply aligns with your values, the people around you will see that. And so I think that's a critical component, along with empathy. Absolutely, Brian.
I would just add, learn to be mindful of the moment we're in, of what you're living through. This is a very tough time, of the people around you, of the people that you want to be around you, and reach out and be aware of the external pressures that are on you, but also listen to yourself, and be very mindful about what you want, and how to do that in the best way, I would say.
Yeah, I would add briefly, when you've got smart people around you, show them that you are aware of that and you trust them to do what they do. I have a little saying that I share at home and at school: you are what you read and what you don't. You are who you listen to and who you don't, and everyone can tell.
Wonderful. Thank you to Brent, our moderator, to all of our panelists. This has really been a wonderful session. I want to make everyone aware of the final session of this series. We will have the Jay Francis, the VP of Current Series and Diversity at Disney Animation. That'll be on March 3rd at 12 p.m. And we will now take you out with one of Greg's tunes from New Fane. So thank you all so much for coming.